those kinds of things make it all worthwhile. And I'm sure that Henrietta and I can reminisce about those kinds of experiences in our life. But it's wonderful to hear the enthusiasm and the interest of young people like Jim Stone. And certainly, I want to pay my very humble respects to the Thompsons for being here with you this evening in honor of your son. I do remember that evening very well 20 years ago, because in that sense I was aspiring myself to make some mark on American Indians and their education in this country. And it was those kinds of experiences that this young man had, and countless others, that inspired those of us who were reaching towards their elderness already to keep plodding away in behalf of American Indian education. And as the topic suggests, this is something that we in the last half of the century in this country have wrestled with, of the opportunities that have eluded the first Americans. On a more joyful note, let me share a little story with you, because I'm reminded more and more all the time that I'm an elder, and Jim sort of reminded me of that again tonight. And one of the advantages we have is that when we go to powwows or go to celebrations, we always get to eat first. And you can see that it's helped me out quite well. Often people have asked the story about why do the Ojibwe people or the Anishinaabe people, why did they settle in Minnesota? Why didn't they move further west, and why didn't weren't they cut off into southern Canada? And why did Dakota people end up in the Badlands and in the area where there are no lakes and rivers and so forth? And Jim, I know there are other Lakota people here, Dakota people, but let me share this little story about how we interpret that from our perspective, not from some of the historians that have written about it. And it goes something like this, that an old elder Chippewa was observed walking around a lake in central Minnesota. And they observed this from a distance, they being the Sioux, or the Dakota people. And they thought, now what is going on here? They observed the old Chippewa walking around this lake. And they observed it for several days. And it got on to be weeks. And they said, you know, those Chippewa, you got to really watch them. We better send out our best scouting party to find out what they're really doing. So they sent out their very best scouting party, and they got closer, and they indeed observed the old Chippewa walking around the lake. But now they could hear that he was counting. 98, 98, and he kept walking around and around and around that lake. And of course, the Dakota people said, we got to find out what's really going on here. We are going to send our very, very best scout to find out what's really going on. And so they did. And of course, the best scout got real close, and he said, they're right. He is walking around and around the lake, counting 98, 98. He could not understand it. He said, well, now these Chippewa are really devious people. I'm going to find out exactly what they're doing. I'm going to get in and do exactly what he's doing. So he did. He followed the old Chippewa around and around the lake. The Chippewa was going 98, and went on for hours, went on for days, pretty soon weeks. And pretty soon the Dakota man got dizzy and he fell in the lake. The Chippewa says, 99, 99. Jim, I'm going to tell one on me now. My wife, Mary Lou, is here. Mary, would you stand up? She has been with me for 33 years, and she's never heard this story. But she has heard about it from some friends of mine. But it's sort of on me, and I don't mind doing this now and then. But it's sort of on her too. But anyway, about 20 years ago, a little over that, I had left a teaching job in the Stillwater school system, which is sort of a suburb now of St. Paul. And I was teaching American history and political science, and I had gone into the Department of Education. And one of the main thrusts we were trying to promote was trying to get Indian language and history infused into the curriculum in the schools. And but I had a rude awakening one evening at dinner when my daughter came home from school and said, "You know, Dad," she said, it's really easy to tell from what we've been studying about Indians in our classes that you are Chippewa and not Sioux." And I thought, well, wonderful, they're finally doing something in our district telling about Indians. And I said, well, how do you know? She says, well, the Sioux are tall and slender, and the Chippewa are short and stout. Mary Lou thought that was very funny. She really got a big charge out of that. So I turned to her and said, "How is it that my daughter is tall and slender?" But that was when my daughter was about 6 years old. Now she looks like her mother and I. So we still have a lot to talk about, a lot of teasing about that. What I would like to do this evening is to try to narrow some statements and comments I have about three different periods of time. Because this question about learning, the question about achievement, and the question about how American Indians fare in the marketplace, on the reservation, in the urban centers and rural centers, still haunts many, many American people, and certainly it poses challenges to tribal leaders throughout this nation. But let's reflect for a moment and go back to the period of time when I was born. And we pick up on the report that Lewis Marion wrote in 1934. Now, Lewis Marion was was commissioned by the federal government to do an analysis or study about American Indians. And one of the things that became very clear to Lewis as he wrote was this whole question of self-determination. He called it self-help. But he said, and I'm paraphrasing him, that if we ever in this country will need to do anything, we need to develop a policy and a system where Indians learn to help themselves. Interesting, because that policy, or that statement, was referenced to by many, many pieces of legislation during the 30s, which was a big period of laws written by the Congress. But it really wasn't looked at very seriously until the mid-1960s and later. So what happened during that period of time when at that time the federal government was contracting more and more with states to provide educational opportunities? You know, the Johnson O'Malley Act, as many of you people have heard, came out of that era. And it says, we will provide resources to the state so they in turn can allocate the monies into the general fund to educate American Indians. The motive or the goal of the government was to civilize American Indians, was to assimilate American Indians. On the other hand, they had a policy of separateness, of placing American Indians on reservations. And so they had, in my view at least, they had a counterproductive policy on one of assimilation, one of, quote, civilization, at the same time saying, you folks stay over in the reservations and we'll do these other things for you. And they began to contract with states to do that. That really didn't take hold in all over the country. The Midwest perhaps mounted the greatest effort to work with reservations. Minnesota in particular, there was just about every reservation except one had contracted with the state to provide these opportunities. And this went on for 20, 25 years. And all the while, resources were going into the general fund, and there were no questions asked to how these dollars were used. Were they used to benefit American Indians, education opportunities, and so forth? And that was sort of about the time I came on the scene in Minnesota in the late 60s, when I became responsible for that program. And indeed, it went into the general fund of a school district, and that was the end of it. At the same time, by the time American Indians were in the 8th or 9th grade, they were a rarity. I mean, there were very few kids left. But we had a commissioner of education at that time that said that we need to address this question, and so we are going to hire someone to do that. Here again, I had one of my little ego trips kind of slipped from under me when they said, Will, would you come in and do this? I was very flattered and honored and come into the department. And I found out that the criteria they laid down was that the person had to have a master's degree. And I thought, that's fine. I found out that I was the only person in Minnesota who had a master's degree that was of Indian ancestry, but that made me think all the harder of all the young people that I went to school with, who I thought were so much smarter than I was, had so much more talent and skills that I did, that were lost. But fortunately, there were a number of other people about my age that began to assemble in the Twin Cities and other parts of the country that began to talk about this question of Indian Ed. And we were fortunate, I believe, that some people took this message to the Congress of the United States in the early 60s. And it wasn't until the late 60s, 68, 69, 70, in that period of time, when the Kennedys commissioned or were commissioned by the Congress to lead some subcommittees and studies on Indian Ed. And what's ensued from that was the National Tragedy Report that was issued by the Congress in 1969. But there was a summary of statements by leading educators, by tribal people, by people like myself and others who were just emerging and speaking out about the atrocities that were occurring in public education across this country because we had no graduates, or so few of them. And so when Commissioners of Education wanted to select someone to lead an education program, the pool was one. And so that message began to come across from the Congress very clearly to states. This may be surprising to many people, but if you look at the leadership of this country then, Richard Nixon was the president. And if you want to put an asterisk about this topic by the president, by President Nixon, you should. Because if you look at leadership in terms of American Indians, you've had a lot of statements made going back to Woodrow Wilson, following right up to President Johnson. But President Nixon was the one who said it and then did it. And his policy on self-determination, in my view, was one of the great policy issues that this country faced, and faced with support from the Congress that really now can be traced to success story one after another on reservations all over this country. It may have come by other presidents. It may have come with Jimmy Carter. It may have come by John F. Kennedy. It may have come by other presidents. But that happened in a period of time when the country was sort of undecided as to what direction they were going to go. I remember the debates in Congress when the national study was written. What should we do? What should we do for Indians again was a common kind of thread in those committee halls. But the self-determination one prevailed, thank goodness. And while we might question how far we've come on this whole question of self-determination, let me remind you of where we were. And any kind of measurement that you would look at, American Indians were at the bottom or near the bottom on every scale that you can imagine. We still have a long way to go. And perhaps there's some gaps that are very, very severe yet. But as I'll point out to you later on in the evening, some of those gaps are narrowing, some we have to pay closer attention to. But that was a pivotal point of time for people like myself who needed that reassurance that the policymakers of this country were sincere about a policy for a change. And what emanated 2 years later was the Indian Education Act of 1972. That was an act of Congress that prevailed. And let me tell you about two little parts of that legislation. Some of you might know Bill Demeritt, but Bill and I were asked to work with Senators Mondale and Kennedy in helping write that legislation. And wherever we had gone, whether it was in Alaska or Florida, Arizona, or Minnesota, Dakotas, November, Michigan, Maine, we heard the same theme, is that we're disillusioned because we have no voice in the affairs of our school district. Parents in particular would bemoan the fact that they were not welcome in the schools, or they were afraid to interact with principals and teachers and superintendents. So one of the two things we tried to get in that legislation was to try to find out how we could put some controls in the hands of parents without challenging the whole system of public education, which theoretically would have said, let's give the American Indians control at the school board level. But you can imagine the kind of test that would be by the states if you start interfering with local autonomies that had been sacred cows for almost a number of centuries. So we tried to find a way to put in that legislation that if a school district was going to participate, and in that days it was called Title IV, now it's called Title V, that they had to have the consensus of the parents of the students involved. Now, in contemporary times, that's really not such a big achievement. But in the early 70s, it really was. It was a lot to say that a citizens group, which had never been done before in any federal legislation, to give that kind of control. Because control was a factor in these countless amounts of testimony that Congress heard and the kinds of concerns that were expressed to other leaders by tribes and by Indian communities throughout this country. Control, control, control. How do you infuse that into public policy without turning the system too far upside down? We got that in. And as a matter of fact, the administration, which happened to be President Nixon, opposed that part of it. We had to go to court. We went to court, and we got that overturned. The commissioner, there was a commissioner of education at that time, it was not a secretary. It forced the secretary or the commissioner to appoint or recommend to the president names of people to serve on an advisory council. A second thing it said was that tantamount to all this control kinds of questions was that parents were important. Again, that's really not very striking because that's all we hear today, parental participation. But interesting, when the United States is challenged in its educational systems or educational results or achievement, namely by other countries across the country, what have we turned to? We've turned to parents and said, you're very, very critical to this process. Well, the American Indian community had been saying that in the late 60s because they realized that that was a critical element that had to be part of their children's education. Such a simple thing, because practically everyone in this room can relate to how their parents encouraged them or supported them in their education. That element was certainly missing as far as many, many American Indians in the public schools were concerned. And where we see dilemmas now in our system, we see the same lack of interest as being a negative factor and force in how well people are doing in our schools. Another item that was in that legislation was that the Commissioner of Education had to appoint a deputy commissioner from a list of candidates selected by an advisory council that was appointed by the president. So we had the challenge at the local level of school boards by saying that they could not submit or participate in this program without the Indian parents' consent. Likewise, the control was put on the president and his executive staff as well by saying you have to appoint from the list of candidates we present to you. I happened to be on that first advisory group, and that was, let me tell you, that was one big struggle. The bureaucracy went to work, and at every turn of the way we stumbled, and they took advantage of that stumble, and they got that delayed time and time again. But we prevailed in the end, and Dr. Bill Demeritt, a Tlingit from Alaska, was our number one choice. He finally was appointed to that deputy position, which he held for a number of years. I only point this out to you because it's that during that pivotal point of time when seemingly public policy was on the side of American Indians, but then once you get into the system, and then when you begin to try to implement and administer and carry things out, they are still insurmountable tasks that people have to undergo. And if you turn that around to the local level, the same thing has occurred. And let me jump ahead almost 20 years to last year in St. Paul, Minnesota, where the Indian Parent Committee disagreed with the school district and how they were spending resources for Title V, and said, we don't agree with you, Mr. Superintendent. We don't agree with you, school board, and we are going to exercise our rights as parents, and we will not sign off on your application. The superintendent said, that's nonsense, you can't do it. I will go to Washington directly. He called some person in Washington and he reported back to the parent committee that they were wrong, that he could disband the committee and he could appoint another committee, and that parent committee indeed would sign off on the budget. Well, that didn't happen that way. The parent committee hung in there and they said, Mr. Superintendent, you're wrong, you can't do that. We were elected by the parents, and until the parents speak, we are your official voice, and we will exercise that responsibility according to our judgment. They did, and they prevailed. So you have the situation at the top, you have the situation at the bottom, and you have almost a 20-year span of time. And one begins to wonder, has anything turned out well? Has anything happened that would make you more optimistic? Indeed, we can go on and on and on and talk about those good stories. And let me share some of those with you. But I want to back up just to 20 years ago for a moment again and talk about a major shift that occurred. These dollars that were targeted for Indian Ed were given they were many times given the responsibility to the parents. In many cases, the Johnson O'Malley funds were contracted now with the tribes. The tribes then dispersed them to public schools. There was a major shift in how those dollars were used. And the shift went primarily to things that would help the self-esteem or the pride in being Ojibwe, Dakota, Crow, Navajo, trying to build up the curriculum areas, the language areas. And so in practically every Title V budget that came across the desk of people like Bill Demert and others in Washington, heavy emphasis on Indian language, culture, and other kinds of characteristics that would enhance the lives of young people's idea of who they were as a person as well as an American Indian. That still is, in some cases, occurring. There's still heavy emphasis on building up the self-esteem. Millions and millions of dollars, and probably billions now, have been spent in Indian Ed since the late 60s. What are we hearing 20 years later? We're hearing that the dropout rate is still high. We are hearing that the achievement levels of students are still low. The gap still prevails, that it's not reducing itself between Indians and their non-Indian cohorts in the school system. We hear that elements of chemical dependency are higher now than they've ever had been before. We see statistics from our penal institutions where numbers are increasing. We hear stories about adult illiteracy. For those of us who've worked in this so long, it's sort of disheartening until you begin to extrapolate this a little bit better and saying, you know, where are you getting your data? Tell us a little bit more about this dropout rate, tell us a little more about the achievement rate, and so forth. We do acknowledge that some of these undesirable characteristics that I mentioned still do prevail. But if you look really carefully, you see tremendous progress over this 20-year period of time that goes back to this self-determination era. I have not been as closely involved with it as I had in those days, but so I can look at it a little bit more objectively. I'm very, very pleased with the things that are happening in our state. And I don't know if our state's any different than others. What is it that's happened? Is it the curriculum in the schools that reflects the culture? Is it more dedicated teachers? Is it more parental support? What's going on here that causes this? Probably all of those. But one of the things that's happening that's on a positive note, where things are going well, are people have jobs. One reservation that I've been working with just recently now is operating a $25 million budget. There are some reservations because of the casinos and gambling where there is 100% employment. Anyone who wants to work for the tribe has a job. The attitude seems to have changed very dramatically now from one of trying to bring the cultural characteristics that were overemphasized now in sync with trying to promote the academic achievement area as well. That's why I am so optimistic. For some reason we've had to go one or the other. We could never find that balance between the cultural importance of education and the academic importance of public education. We're finding that more and more, and I think that's coming about because of the economic development that is happening in some reservations. It's happening in thank goodness, in Minnesota, in practically every one. There are some that are still lagging behind, but we see this tremendous growth in the economy because people are working, people feel a self-worth, they have taken a different kind of interest in education, they are being exposed to other sets of life that require thinking skills, computational skills, writing skills, and so forth. And the people that are working in the public schools are telling us that it's easier to be a counselor because they don't have to persuade the parents as much as they used to come into the school and visit with them about reading scores and math scores and so forth. So the employment issue in Minnesota has been a very, very, very important development. There are many who say that they've done this at a great moral expense because it's gambling. And that's really not what we should be telling people, that to make a living working in a gambling casino and so forth. And I don't know. I suppose there might be something to that. On the other hand, the motivation behind some of those arguments come from those who also want a piece of the pie. And we're worried and nervous that American Minnesota Indians and others have found the same kind of dilemma when they succeed and are employing themselves and being productive in the economy, that someone is going to try to take it away from them. We hope that policymakers resist that temptation, because it reminds you of a story where an officer arrested a woman for going down a one-way street in the wrong direction. And she said to the officer, maybe the arrow is pointing the wrong way. And somehow or other we have to make sure that it isn't either one or the other when it comes to these economies on reservations that are fragile in themselves, but are so important to the lives of those people that live there day in and day out and have to have a subsistence so they can spend some time with children. About 5 years ago, I and a number of others were getting somewhat disillusioned by these statements about high dropout rates. And so we began to talk about what are some alternatives of just having more money for more programs that weren't, if there were more money and more programs and we weren't doing the job, what is it that we could do? And this theme still is very critical, I believe. And that is, Money's important, but it can't buy everything. It can't buy that one-to-one relationship with the child and a parent. And if that parent is wondering where they're going to sleep that night or tomorrow night, or wondering how they're going to put food on the table for their family, or conversely, if the children are worried about being abused or feeling neglected or feeling all these insecure feelings when they know their parents are either separated or they can't find work and they kind of bounce from relative to relative. How can a teacher manage a child that comes with that background, day in and day out? I think you can be a superhuman teacher and have difficulty working with children who come from the backgrounds that many of the children were coming from when they had no economic stability behind them. So we asked the policymakers of Minnesota to consider an alternative, and saying that basically this is a responsibility of everyone in our state, not just education, that all the social services that are provided by our state should be delivered in a sensitive manner, in an understanding manner. The 3Ms and the IBMs and the Pillsburys and the General Mills, etc., also had a responsibility here to see what they could do about employment opportunities. So we asked the governor to put together a group of people from the business sector, from the social service sector, and the leaders of the tribe. That didn't go forward like we wanted it to go, but it did create a lot of thinking on the part of industry. And now you're finding those kinds of efforts sporadic at best, but nevertheless they're there, where there is some effort by some of the major corporate bodies in Minnesota, reaching out to Indian communities, whether they be on the reservation or whether they be in the urban centers of Minneapolis or St. Paul or Duluth. We think there's some gaps there. We think that this whole social service in the private sector has to amalgamate a little bit more effectively with some thought and some vision as to what they can do. I see this in the latter stages of the century, somewhat like I saw it in 1968 when I went down and visited the Rough Rock Demonstration School in Arizona. It was essentially one of the first times I had ever left Minnesota. And that was an experience in itself. But I remember after several trips down there, going to the school. It was run by Dylan Platero at the time. It was control was a factor, but it was a family style. It was sort of you had a classroom with a teacher and you had grandmothers sitting around the room. They were knitting, they were weaving, and I remember some of the experiences like it was right now. The little Indian child would be writing, looking over at Grandma. Grandma would nod, she'd smile, she'd go on writing. She'd get up, another little child would go up and walk over to this other grandma and talk in Navajo. They'd giggle a little bit, she'd come back and sit down and start writing again. What struck me about that is this exactly what we're talking about, this whole parental, this whole support system that evaded us. And whether we do it like the Navajos did it in their simple, meaningful ways, or whether we do it with the corporate support of an IBM or 3M, really makes no difference. If we can just get that kind of environment to work in, so that the stakeholder is not only the child in the classroom, but the parent that might be sitting around the room working on a computer or working on something that can translate into employment or opportunity once they left the classroom. That's still sort of a blueprint that's unfolding, and I think we'll hear more about that as we approach this next century. Because I think we have learned indeed that you got to have that support system. You have to have that parental interest, whether it's the extended family or whether it's the mother or father. And we know that from every family in this country, as we see the decay of urban education and the restoration of that and its struggles, that element is missing. And we're trying to recapture that, and maybe it's almost too late. But certainly it isn't in the American Indian community, because as I talk to tribal leaders in our state in particular, they have recognized the importance of this support system. And they themselves, as elected bodies, are reaching out to their children in a far different way than they were 20-some years ago. I can remember we were in Kansas City. A number of us were trying desperately to get on the agenda of NCAI. Some of you may not know that, but it's the National Congress of American Indians, which was the most influential national organization in the United States at that time. Headed up by some of the real heavyweight leaders. One was Roger Jourdain at the time, another was Wendell Chino from Arizona. People of that stature, very, very important people, and had led their tribes for many years and had emerged into those leadership positions. And a number of us kept begging them, can we get on your agenda? Can we get on your agenda? And talk about these issues that we have to face trying to put Indian Ed programs together. It was always yes, 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 we'll do it. But if a conference went from Monday to Thursday, we got on the agenda on Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock. Some of you may not know, but the real story behind that is that's how the National Indian Ed Association got formed. Because we could not get on those agendas. If we were put on the agenda, it was at the end. And while tribal leaders were saying, go ahead, do this, we weren't getting that kind of support. So we did form NIEA. In fact, as Mary Lou ran that for about 2 years out of the basement of our home. But it's still going, and it's still having a lot to do with agendas. It's no longer on at Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock. It's on at Monday morning at 10 o'clock, and practically every agenda that you see. And so those people that pushed hard for NIEA and pushed hard to get on agendas really deserve a lot of credit. And I'm trying to think of anybody from Iowa, but we had a lot of people from all over the United States on that. One of the persons that was one of your speakers, Rupert Costo and Jeanette, they were the ones that really motivated people like myself and Rosemary Christensen and Bill Demert and Sparlin Nord and Dylan Potero and Dave Risling, countless other people, to form this association. And they took a bunch of people out to Princeton, I remember one time, and after Princeton, which I didn't go to, but they came back and said, well, let's see what we can do in Minnesota. And so we did talk this up, and we eventually formed NIEA, and it's still in operation. So I'm really proud of what that organization has done and what they've been able to accomplish. And now they work in concert with NCAI and the National Tribal Leaders Groups and other national organizations around the country. And I don't imagine there's any piece of legislation that comes before the Congress where they are not consulted on how that may work. Will Indian Ed ever go away? The question keeps cropping up by the non-Indians. I hear it all the time in the Midwest and saying, Why should we have Indian Ed? Why shouldn't we treat Indians like we treat everybody else? Why can't we just forget about that and just put them in the classroom with other kids and let them learn at the same rate and have the same opportunities? Well, there may be some merit to that argument if we treated indeed everybody alike, if we accepted everybody for who they were. But there's going to be a long period in my view before that'll occur. We have a generation of people that still don't understand why American Indians have a special relationship with the federal government. I can remember 20 years ago, David, get out, remember, I'll give you a little quiz. Remember what I said about that? But whenever I would go out to people and talk to them, I would say to them, if there's one thing that remember what I said, and that is this, that there is a special relationship between American Indians and the federal government that no one else has. If you don't understand that, you will never understand American Indians. For that reason alone, I don't see treaty making coming, the treaties being abrogated like Wisconsin would like to see it happen, and others. Or I don't see any public policies changing on the part of the Congress. In fact, they're stronger. More and more strength to them all the time. This special relationship has begun to be understood by more and more people. And they're not wavering, they're faltering by the wayside. We do hear every once in a while during the spearing season in Wisconsin that those treaties should be abolished. But the chairman of the Select Committee on Indian Affairs was out in Wisconsin not long ago reaffirming the government's commitment and asking for calm and asking for cooperation. Those will not change, I don't believe, at least in my lifetime. But that doesn't mean that we have to look at some of the emerging issues with a little caution. And one of them is this, and I'm going to conclude my remarks about this, this whole question of separateness. This policy the government had of being separate, acculturation, assimilation, civilization, kind of rolled up in one, has sorted itself out a little more clearly in contemporary times. And that is